As I indicated before, this is really a condensed version. This is something that in the turfgrass insects we actually have about 5 or 6 lectures on turfgrass insects. The other thing that I'm going to be giving you is what I call my introduction to integrated pest management. I find it interesting. Integrated pest management was the in thing when I first started graduate school back in the 70s and became a faculty member in the 80s at Penn State. But now we're taking a look at some other things, and one of the terminologies that we use now is plant health care. And we're even talking about that. You'll hear the pathologist and the entomologist talking about turf health care. And why have we moved from integrated pest management to plant health care? My feeling is integrated pest management is emphasizing the pests. But what is it you're trying to grow? You're trying to grow plants. And so paying attention to what the plant is doing, what the needs of the plant are usually the keys to reducing the stresses that allow for pests to have their way with that turfgrass. Well, let's get started. Remember that there's a whole group of different kinds of insects that can attack turfgrass. And I find when I talk with most turfgrass managers, they consider that white grubs are their pest number one. If you happen to go down to the southern states, for any of you that intern on golf courses down in Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas, or places like that, they'll talk about mole crickets. Both white grubs and mole crickets are what we would call soil inhabiting pests. They live in the soil profile, but when they feed and do their activity, they can damage the roots of the turfgrass and actually kill those roots. And what's turfgrass without any roots? Dead. Absolutely. And so these can really kill the pests or the turfgrass. There's also a whole suite of caterpillars. Now I find caterpillars is kind of interesting to me because virtually all of these caterpillars eat the leaf blades of the turfgrass. And what is turfgrass that is missing some leaf blades? Well, to you, it's something that we just recently mowed. So in essence, we select grass species because of their ability to be cut on a periodic basis. And so if you think about it, caterpillars really should be very minor pests. And generally in high cut turf, they are minor pests. However, on the shortcut turf that we've got on golf course greens and tees, they can be a real nuisance pest because they can cause some imperfections in that playing surface. Another one that's often missed are weevils. We have a whole group of weevils that can attack turfgrass, and some recent studies that have been done here in Ohio and in Indiana are indicating that bill bugs, which is one group of these weevils, can be in many cases as damaging or more damaging than the white grubs. And basically what these bill bugs do is they have larvae that burrow down through the stem, so they're stem borers, but when they reach the crown, they will eat the crown. And what is a turfgrass plant without a crown? Dead. and so again, it can these can definitely kill those plants. We also have some insects that suck. And in this particular case, I know you probably thought they all sucked, but the reality is these are ones that have sucking mouth parts, and these are chinch bugs. Chinch bugs are generally more common in lawn turf and in sport turf than in the highly managed turf on golf courses, but we do occasionally see some chinch bug infestations that occur on golf courses. And finally, one that I'm not going to really talk about, we always have things that are associated with turf, and in this particular case, this would be like ants, bees, and wasps that nest in the soil in turfgrass. So they're not really damaging the turf, but people don't like to have them around. There's nothing more fun to an entomologist than watching a golfer land his ball into a bunker someplace that's got cicada killer wasp in the same bunker. And of course, when he goes over there and is fussing about getting his ball out of that bunker, and all of a sudden this big honking wasp comes up in front of his face and goes like that, and they go, oh no, I can't. They're harmless, not going to bother you, but they are pretty intimidating. Now, the last thing that I'd like to leave you with here is that even though I've given you this list of organisms here and given you the implication that this is primarily something that occurs here in the United States, all of these groups or insects that are similar to these groups occur worldwide. In other words, if you go to Australia, they would have the red-headed cockchafer. If you go to Japan, they're going to have the hunting billbug in there. If you go to Africa, they've got the African mole cricket there. And so virtually all of these groups of insects are worldwide. Wherever turf is managed, there will be species of these different kinds of insects that could potentially damage the turf. Now, we often break or at least when I'm writing textbooks and talking about these things, I usually break them up according to where they actually live in the turf. And so we can have soil inhabiting pests. These are usually the toughest ones to get to, because where do we apply our pesticides? Well, we apply our pesticides to the surface of the turf, and if these insects are down in the soil, we have to get our pesticide off of the blades of the grass if we've sprayed it, or if it's a granule, we have to work it off of the granule, move it through the thatch material, and get it down to where these insects are located. On the other hand, we have some leaf and stem inhabiting things. I've already mentioned to you that the caterpillars, they really don't inhabit the leaves per se. They usually live in the thatch, but they come out at nighttime to feed on the leaf blades. And so in that particular case, if I've got an insecticide that I want them to eat, a stomach insecticide, I need to leave that on that leaf surface and leave it there. If I've got things like chinch bugs or bill bugs that are in that thatch interface or in that particular area, again, I've got to work a little bit to get the insecticide off of the surface and into that zone. And then, of course, the nuisance pests are usually living in and around our turfgrass habitat, but they're usually not causing any real problems. I'm not going to be able to go through all of these pests, but I just wanted to point out to you that I'm really giving you a very short, simple summary of the different pests that occur in these particular zones. In this first zone, the ones that occur pretty much on the surface, they're feeding primarily on the leaf blades and the above ground stems. We have groups of chewing pests, and you probably don't recognize, but all of those are caterpillars. So we have sod webworm caterpillars, cutworm caterpillars, armyworm caterpillars. We even have some butterflies called skippers that have caterpillars that feed on turf grass. This is why I always have to kind of chuckle a little bit when I hear my environmentalist friends say, oh, we don't like turf, it's this green desert out there, it doesn't have anything in it. Yet they're the same ones that want to plant butterfly gardens. And they don't realize that one of the common butterflies that would come to their flowers in that garden actually are grass feeders. And so you need to have some grass out there for the skipper larvae to feed on in order to have those butterflies. We also have some sucking pests in here. I'm not really going to talk about most of these. As you can see, there's a whole group here that aren't even insects, but mites. Things like Bermuda grass mites, clover mites, wintergreen mite, Banks grass mites. These are insects that all can inhabit and damage the turf in particular situations. We also have some aphids. There's actually about a dozen species of aphids that can occur in turf grass, but it's this green bug aphid here in North America that often can cause some significant turf damage. Now I'm going to first go through the caterpillar complex, and in this one we're going to talk about the sod webworms. And again, I want to point out there's a whole slew of species. There's easily a half a dozen species anywhere in North America that could be in your turf. You don't really need to know all these species. It's really kind of irrelevant because the larvae all pretty well have the same type of behavior. Now, if you do happen to move down to the southern areas to manage turf, you will find that there is a tropical sod webworm that occurs in more southern turf. So this is going to be primarily a pest of Bermuda grass, St. Augustine grass, and so forth. These true sod webworms are usually pests in cool season turf grass and transition zone turf grasses. The damage themselves can be mistaken for different, let me see if I can. Yes, I remember how to do this. Damage can be mistaken for multiple things, and if I just showed you this picture and said that I took this picture in mid-May sometime, what would you think that is? It's a little blanched area, maybe 2 inches in diameter. Looks like dollar spot, absolutely. And how am I going to tell whether it's dollar spot or it's a caterpillar that's causing dollar spot-like symptoms? Well, I always joke with golf course managers, you know, you got to get off your cart and go over to that spot, get down on your hands and knees and dig around in there. And of course, for those of you that have had your plant pathology, you know that dollar spot leaves these very distinctive little lesions and marks on the leaf blades. In this particular case, if I dig around in that turf, if I move this aside, usually the first thing that I will discover are these little pellets in there, and the pellets will either be brown or green. If they're green, that's telling me that I've got an active caterpillar. And what is that? That's caterpillar poop. The technical term for it is frass. Now, if it's green, what does that tell me? Well, that tells me that the caterpillar just recently pooped that out, and so there's probably still caterpillars around. Now, the most distinctive feature of the sod webworms is, number one, they're quite small. This is only about 1 inch long. It's a fully grown sod webworm. But if you can pull them out of their little burrows that they have in this thatch zone, you'll notice that they have these very distinctive rows of spots down the body, and that's very typical of the sod webworm larvae. The adult moths you've all seen. If you've been out walking in turf or mowing the turf, you see these little buff-colored moths that sort of fly up out of the turf, take a little dart 4 or 5 feet away, and then land back down into the turf. If you can find them, if you can see them, you'll notice that they are small moths. One of the most distinctive features is that these moths roll their wings around the body. And number two, they have what appears to be a distinctive snout. Now, as I mentioned before, there's a whole lot of different species of these, but virtually all of them have that same characteristic. Roll their wings around the body, have a distinctive snout, and typically when they land in the turf, this is their normal resting pose. As you can see, they orient themselves upside down. They stick those palps or mouth parts down on the leaf blade and hold the rest of the body out. And in essence, it looks like a dead leaf blade. And we think this is camouflage to protect them from birds that would love to eat them. But it also can be a little bit annoying when you flush one of these out and you go over try to find it. You can't see it until you get close enough that you might be able to see it. It sees you and it flies off again. And so they can be a little bit annoying in trying to determine what species you're really dealing with. But as I stated before, really only a turf entomologist is probably interested in that. Now, in high-cut turf, in turf in the lawns, turf in sport fields and places like that, even on golf courses in the fairways and in the roughs, we rarely see any sod webworm damage. However, when you get on the short-cut turf of tees and greens, this is the damage, and you may not realize what you're seeing here, but each one of these little brown marks in here, one here, one there, all through these, those are sod webworm larvae that actually have a burrow down into the thatch, but at nighttime they come up to the surface and they burrow just below the mow line, eating the grass blades and leaving a little silken trail in there. Now, the thing I find real interesting about this is this does not interfere with ball roll. The ball will roll true across that particular surface. The real problem is that birds know what's there. And so if the birds see these little brown specks in there, they're going to walk onto that surface and start pecking and pulling to try to pull out the larvae that are in their burrows. And so it's really bird activity that's more of a problem than the sod webworms. Here's a close-up again. You can actually sort of see a little trail that's coming in here. And this little trail is actually top dressing and fecal pellets that are attached to some silk webbing. The caterpillar itself, you can almost see a little trail going right here. The caterpillar during the daytime is actually hiding in a little burrow that'll be about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch down in the profile of the turf. And as I stated before, birds that are experienced know this, and so they're going to be pecking around there trying to pull out that juicy little morsel as food. Most of the sod webworms that we're finding in turfgrass have at least 2 generations per year. They generally overwinter as larvae in the soil. They come up to the surface, finish their development, pupate, and emerge as adults. Those adults typically lay eggs, and then we have a real large larval population, typically in late June through early part of July. And this is often a time that golf course superintendents say that we get a lot of bird activity on our greens and tees at that time. Now, you can see the same bird activity in lawns, but again, neither the bird activity or the sod webworms are causing any problems in those situations. The next group are bigger caterpillars, and I'm going to sort of put these two together because they're actually in the same family of insects, the noctuids. These are the cutworms and the armyworms, and typically the cutworms have been defined in agricultural crops as being fairly large, robust caterpillars that creep around at nighttime and cut plants off. In other words, they will find a small seedling plant that has come up. They'll actually nibble away at the base of it until it just sort of falls over. So they're kind of like little lumberjacks in that aspect. However, in turfgrass, we don't grow plants that way. Basically, in turfgrass habitat, we've got lots of stems, and they'll feed on the stems and the grass blades there. And so we don't see this sort of cutting of the plants off like we would in a vegetable garden or out in a cornfield plant or soybean plant field or something like that. We also have armyworms. Armyworms, and by the way, the real difference, cutworms are generally solitary. They live by themselves. And as a matter of fact, when they get to be large, when they get to be 4th, 5th, 6th instar larvae, they can be cannibalistic. So it's a pretty good practice as a cutworm to stay away from your bigger cousins that are out there, because if they discover you, they're going to eat you. And so you want to stay as far away as you can from the rest of them. On the other hand, the armyworms are kind of interesting in that they have what we call a gregarious habit. In other words, they prefer to live together, they prefer to feed together, they're not cannibalistic and so forth. And as a matter of fact, it's kind of fun to mess with armyworms sometimes when you find a real infestation marching across the turf eating all the grass blades down. If you pick up one of the larvae and move it somewhere else, it will usually stop feeding and just start wandering around because it says, where's all my brothers and sisters? I don't feel comfortable here by myself. And it's kind of an unusual thing with them. By far the most common big caterpillar that we get here in the cool season turfgrass is the black cutworm. This is a species that actually overwinters down in the Gulf states, so every year it has to fly back up here early in the springtime, but it often arrives on storm fronts. I wouldn't doubt it at all with some of these rain fronts that we had. And did anybody notice the winds that we had yesterday? Pretty severe. And these caterpillars, or the moths themselves, can actually fly up into the jet winds and be blown 500 to 1,000 miles in a 24-hour period. And so they really don't have much problem at all moving from the Gulf states back up in here fairly early in the season. And usually here in Ohio we have 2 generations of black cutworms. The first generation typically occurs in late May through June, and then we have the second generation in July and early August. Now, the cutworms make a very different kind of feeding. They actually will, again, live in a burrow during the daytime, but this isn't a silk line burrow. They come out at nighttime and they nibble off the surface of the turf grass. And so what you're seeing here, this is actually some shortcut turf on the approach to a green. So it's not really the green surface here, but they can do it on a green surface. And what you're seeing is what I call pock marks. And so you get these little pits and depressions in the surface. Now, if that's on the green, that's obviously going to interfere with ball roll. And so golf course superintendents are very sensitive about these. When the mowing crew says, I'm seeing a few of the cutworm spots over on green number 5, they're probably going to go out there and spray that pretty quickly. All you need is maybe 4 or 5 or 6 of those pits or pock marks on the surface to elicit some mowing. Now here I got a picture. I went over to our turf facility at nighttime, and with a flashlight I found a black cutworm that had come out of its burrow. The burrow is right over here, and as you can see, it was eating the grass blades at nighttime. Another interesting thing that I found with the cutworms is that cutworms in turf grass don't act anything like they do as cutworms in field crops or in vegetable crops or things like that. In those plants, the literature says that they lay batches of eggs on the surfaces of the plants. What we find in turf is that they lay their eggs as single eggs, typically singles or doubles, attached to the leaf blade tips. Now, if that was a green, what's going to happen to that tomorrow morning? Going to mow it. And so what's going to happen to those eggs? They're going to end up in the mower basket. And this is one of the things, again, when I talk to golf course superintendents that are constantly battling cutworm issues, one of the things you don't want to do, I see it all the time on the golf courses, mowing crew mows the green, they take the clipping basket over to the side of the green where there's some bushes or shrubs or something and just dump the clippings there. Basically what you're doing is you're creating a black cutworm nursery. A very nice little place for them to reside, usually a little shady over there and so forth. And they'll usually complete their first, second, and third instar, the little tiny larvae. Then when they reach fourth instar, they'll start moving and migrating out, and at that time they'll end up again back on your greens. How far do these caterpillars move? Again, I had a graduate student a few years ago that was studying this. Very easy to see. If you go out in the morning when the dew is still on, you can see these little trails in there. Now, those could be several things. You could have beetles walking across the surface of the turf. You might even have earthworms if there's been a rain that comes up and moves across the turf. But very commonly, this is also what cutworm larvae will look like. And they typically will move anywhere from 50 to 100 feet in a single night. And this is one of the other reasons why, if I was going to spray this surface for cutworms, I also need to spray the adjacent turf for cutworm. Even though I'm not seeing any damage from those cutworms, what I want to do is try to lower that cutworm population so that I don't have big cutworms moving back onto that green surface as soon as the insecticide residue has dissipated. The next big cutworm that we have is the armyworm group. And there's quite a few of these. I'm just going to pick on the fall armyworm. This is a very common one that we see primarily in the southern and transition zones. These are very different in terms of their egg-laying behavior. And basically, these refuse to lay their eggs on the turfgrass blades themselves. That's very different than the cutworm. They lay their eggs on the grass blades. But somehow the adult moth can determine whether a plant or a structure is overhanging turf. And she'll lay a batch of eggs. Now, it doesn't look like maybe all that many eggs, but there's actually 3 layers of eggs in that egg mass. And typically she'll lay an egg mass that may be 200 to 300 up to 600 or 700 eggs in a single egg laying batch. Now, what will happen is that these are up out of the turf. They're out of the way of predators. They're out of the way of the parasites. But when they're ready to hatch, the larvae just drop down to the turf down below and will start feeding. And if you think about it, if I've got 300 to 600 caterpillars all feeding together and all enjoying being together, you can basically get this horde of caterpillars that literally will mow the turf down. And that's where they get the name armyworm. They are an army of worms marching across the turf, basically eating grass blades down. The reason why I go through all of this is that one of the things that I try to teach, again, in the southern states where this is most common, is try to teach the mowing crew to make sure that when they pull that marker off of the hole and throw it off to the side, check the pole, check the flag, because quite often you can find in a single night 2 or 3 fall armyworm egg masses that have been laid on there. And so if you squash those eggs and wipe them off of there, you've gotten rid of probably maybe a couple of thousand potential caterpillars. There's also, here's a ball washing post. over here, and you can see there's a fresh egg mass here, and there's an old egg mass right up underneath there. And again, inspecting these areas, just scraping those eggs off or squashing them is a good way to get rid of a lot of those. Now, what's the difference between the cutworm and the armyworm structurally? Virtually all the armyworms have distinctive stripes on them. And so as you can see here, there's distinctive stripes on them. When you take a look at the cutworm, it may have a sort of a broad, darker band running down the back of it, but it doesn't have these distinctive multiple stripes running down the body. When it comes to caterpillars, quite often caterpillars are tough to find by just looking for them. They're hiding in burrows during the daytime, and so they can escape detection. One of the techniques that we use here is using a detergent flush. Now, what the detergent flush is, now the detergent flush is nothing more than a 2-gallon bucket, or if you've got a 5-gallon bucket, that's really kind of irrelevant. You put 1 tablespoon of detergent per gallon of water. Here's one of our former graduate students, Yi, and she's mixed up the soapy water. Now, we use a 1 square yard frame. We marked that. Now, I have 2 frames. I've got a metal one that we use when we're going to a place to do a lot of research. I have another one that's just PVC pipe that I can snap together and break it down and sample when I'm out working with golf course superintendents. Now, basically what we're going to do is take that soapy water or detergent water, and we're going to just apply it to the surface. And for a 1 square yard area, you're going to need about 2 gallons of that soapy mix. And so 2 tablespoons in that 2-gallon bucket, and apply that. What's really nifty about this detergent is the detergent, apparently it's like getting soap in your eyes. And the insects really come to the surface quite rapidly. What we find is interesting is that the cutworms, armyworms, the big caterpillars come up almost immediately. They come up real fast. There'll be other things that come up to the surface. Earthworms will come up. If you're not sure what's there, this little black turfgrass Atenius adult beetle, sometimes you'll get billbug adults will come up to the surface. There's an earthworm. That's a regular earthworm. I've had some people that have gotten these little tiny earthworms. They thought those were nematodes, but those are actually just another family of earthworms. Now, the one thing that you didn't see were the sod webworms. And what we find is that this detergent material needs to work into the sod webworm burrows in order for them to be flushed out. And so that's why we also mark this. You need to go away, come back about 15 minutes later, and quite often you'll find the sod webworms. Now, again, you can see sod webworm larvae are much smaller than those black cutworms. And typically what we do, this is a confirmation. If you think you've got caterpillars but aren't sure, this is a good way to confirm that. If you're following an integrated pest management program where you want to actually monitor the caterpillar population and the numbers that are there, it's a good way for you to get those kinds of numbers in your record books. Now, when it comes to managing these pests, you'll notice that in general, entomologists talk about 3 different categories of controls: cultural controls, biological controls, and chemical controls. Under cultural controls, we consider host plant resistance as being a very important one. And I'm here to tell you that the sod webworms and armyworms cannot tolerate endophytic turf grasses. So if you can grow perennial ryegrass or the festuca, fescues that have endophytes in them, you won't get any sod webworms or armyworms. What we have found is the black cutworm doesn't seem to be susceptible to the endophyte alkaloids, and so that doesn't work in that particular case. What am I talking about? Egg removal? Again, what I'm really talking about is egg management. If you're mowing the surfaces of this turf grass every morning, make sure that you take those clippings further away, or better yet, take them to a composting facility, and that will destroy the eggs at that time. When it comes to biological controls, we do have quite a few predators and parasites. I think these are useful in higher cut turf. On the short cut turf of a golf course green or tee, probably not going to do the job that you'd like to have. When it comes to chemical controls, most superintendents will undergo a curative treatment. In other words, once they find the caterpillars, they'll go out and spray them and kill them that way. But we do have some new insecticides. We've got a new insecticide called acelepryn, which can actually be applied at its higher dosage rate in April, and you won't have any caterpillars in that turf for the entire season. It lasts virtually the entire season in its activity. So you could do a preventive treatment. Now, the problem is that if I use a pyrethroid for that curative treatment, probably going to cost me about $15 an acre. If I use that acelepryn as a preventive, that's going to run me about $140 an acre. So you can see the price differential. But what I find is there's a lot of golf course superintendents that say, okay, I'm going to invest in that acelepryn on my golf course greens, and I'll use the curative technique for the rest of my golf course where I'm not worried about the damage. So basically they're trying to prevent damage on the high impact areas and then just adopt a curative approach somewhere else. Another group that I didn't mention at the very beginning are actually some flies, and these are called crane flies or leather jackets. The larvae are maggots, and they're pretty tough, and that's why they're given the name leather jackets. We've always had crane flies here in North America, but most of our native crane flies seem to feed on decaying organic matter. So if you had a heavy thatch problem or something like that, they would show up, but they wouldn't be actually damaging the turf. However, I guess it's been 3 decades ago, we did import some crane flies in from Europe, and this is the European crane fly and the European marsh crane fly. What's interesting to me about these particular crane flies is they prefer to feed on green leaf material. And so these are damaging the turf. They're primarily in the Pacific Northwest and also in the northeastern North American states. But we did confirm just this last year that we now have the marsh crane fly up in the Cleveland area, and so we're probably going to have to start battling that one. Crane flies themselves look like giant mosquitoes. The body itself is about 1 inch long. The wingspan's maybe 2 inches. And as you can see, those really long legs, those can spread out to 4 inches in diameter. I always find it interesting. People see these, oh my God, look at that giant mosquito. No, it's not a mosquito. It's a crane fly. And what's interesting is that most of these crane fly adults only live for about 3 to 5 days. And during that period of time, they don't really have time to eat or anything else, and so they don't really have functional mouth parts. The larvae themselves, a fully grown crane fly maggot or larva can be about 1 inch long, typically has a dark head capsule and these very distinctive sort of little finger-like structures coming off of the tip of the abdomen. These can reach really large populations. This is up in upstate New York. One of my colleagues was working with them up there. And the lawn care company made the mistake of panicking, and they sprayed this lawn, and you can see all of these maggots that came out of that lawn, and in the next rain they washed down into the gutter here and really created a mess in that particular area. The damage itself, remember that these are going to be feeding on the grass blades, and when you get those high populations, they can really thin out the turf. Now, they haven't killed the turf in here because the roots and the crowns are still here, and with a little water, a little fertilizer, you can get this to come back, but they are definitely thinning out that turf.